going to fall over. No, it isn't. Okay. Let me leave it over here. Well, good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here in Manila, and it's nice to see so many people here, although it's not surprising, of course, given that this is an incredibly important issue for the Philippines, as Senator Angara has just said. I'd like to start off by thanking the Angara Centre for inviting me out here. It is a pleasure to be here. And I'd also like to congratulate Professor John Nye for giving us speakers clear and concise directions, marching orders, on what was required of us today. He asked us to give actionable ideas for policymakers faced with managing the South China Sea dispute, which many analysts, including myself, have sometimes characterized as being almost, if not completely, intractable. Well, in my presentation today, I'd like to offer 5 main policy recommendations. Of course, there are others, but these are the ones I want to focus on in the time available to me today. Some of these recommendations are already being pursued in one form or another, and some of my policy recommendations will be much more difficult to implement than others. I realize that, but I think it's still important to put them up on the screen and discuss them. So first off, in view of the fact that a legal or political settlement of the dispute is currently out of reach, the claimant states should focus on designing and implementing effective, now notice I've italicized the word effective, crisis prevention and conflict management mechanisms. I'll come back to this word effective later on. I think it's very important. Secondly, all parties need to genuinely commit themselves to resolving these disputes under the 1982 United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, and to bring their claims into line with accepted principles of international law. Thirdly, like-minded countries should coordinate their positions and at regional and international forums emphasize the vital importance of complying with international legal norms, upholding freedom of navigation and unimpeded use of the global commons, including in the air and on and under the sea. Notice I used the word in the air, and I wrote these notes before China announced its JDIZ last week. Fourthly, one of the principal sources of contention in the South China Sea is over fishery resources. In order to mitigate this problem, the claimant should, as a priority, negotiate fishing agreements covering areas of overlapping jurisdiction and also agree on joint management of fisheries. Fifth, we hear a lot about joint development. Personally, I think joint development in the South China Sea is rather unrealistic, given the scope, the size of the disputed areas, and the involvement of multiple parties, 6 parties. I think that the development of energy resources can only proceed once maritime boundaries are delimited. That is, maritime boundaries are resolved. And I take you back to point 2, that should be done under UNCLOS. So let's take each of these points in turn. I look at the South China Sea dispute a lot. It takes up most of my days and nights sometimes. And I'm often asked the question, can the South China Sea dispute be resolved? Well, the short answer to that is yes, it can. And there are 2 ways of doing that. The parties could submit their claims to the International Court of Justice, and the ICJ could make a ruling on the sovereignty of the atolls. Or the claimants could sit down and negotiate a settlement among themselves that deals with the issue of sovereignty, delimits maritime boundaries, and deals with the issue of access to maritime resources. However, based on current trends, the prospects of either of these settlements is very remote. China has rejected international legal arbitration as a means of resolving its territorial and maritime boundary disputes. And over the past few years, nearly all of the claimants have moved to strengthen their territorial and jurisdictional claims through national legislation, submissions to the United Nations, and more commonly through so-called acts of administration. In other words, the claimants have hardened their positions, they've dug in their heels on this issue. And that, I think, makes the compromises and concessions that would be needed to reach a negotiated settlement, it puts them that much further out of reach today. So in the absence of a resolution, then, the parties should focus on crisis prevention and conflict management mechanisms. That is to say, putting in place agreements that prohibit certain kinds of behavior, reduce tensions, and prevent incidents at sea from escalating into unwanted crises. This is vital. Over the past few years, the frequency of incidents at sea involving warships, patrol boats, fishing boats, and survey vessels has been increasing. And to my mind, it's just a question of time before one of these incidents, one of these tense standoffs, turns into something rather ugly, in which lives are lost and bilateral relations are pushed to the brink. I think that's also the case in the East China Sea as well. Far more dangerous situation than in the South China Sea. China and ASEAN have been discussing conflict management mechanisms on and off for almost 2 decades now, but the results have been disappointing, to say the least. It was 11 years ago that ASEAN and China signed the Declaration on the Conduct of Parties in the South China Sea, and that agreement has not yet even been partially implemented. In September of this year, ASEAN and China agreed in principle, only in principle, to establish a search and rescue hotline. This after 11 years. And crucially, discussions on joint cooperative measures have excluded one important area that's outlined in the DOC, and that is safety of navigation and communication at sea. Cooperative projects in this area might diffuse some of the tense standoffs at sea that we've seen over the past few years, but ASEAN and China are simply not discussing that area. It's too sensitive, too contentious. Now, of course, we've heard an awful lot over the last year or so about the much vaunted Code of Conduct, which is the next step on from the DOC. I'm increasingly skeptical about the Code of Conduct. I think it's process-driven rather than results-oriented. China's lack of enthusiasm for an effective, comprehensive, and legally binding Code of Conduct is manifest. It's very clear to us. It was only in May of this year that China agreed to consultations on negotiations. Not negotiations, consultations on negotiations. And my guess is that China will seek to draw out these talks for as long as possible and water down any of the provisions that other states may put forward. I suspect, therefore, that maybe a year or 2 or 3 years from now, ASEAN and China will produce a code of conduct that will be largely symbolic in nature. It will have lots of fine words, but I don't think it will curtail freedom of action, China's freedom of action in the South China Sea, or impact the central drivers of the dispute in any meaningful way. My advice to Philippine policymakers in that case is don't sign it. I don't think we want to see a repeat of the DOC, which was watered down and has no teeth. If the Code of Conduct, the final product, is not effective and robust and comprehensive, then I don't think ASEAN countries should sign it. I think it's better not to have one than to have a largely symbolic agreement. I think what the Philippines and other countries should do during the coming talks on the Code of Conduct is to insist on an effective set of measures similar to those contained in the INC-Sea agreements. INC-Sea, Incidents at Sea agreements. This is a series of agreements that was signed between the Soviet Union and later Russia and 12 or 13 countries, most of which were in Western Europe, but also in Japan and South Korea. These INC-Sea agreements, they set out rules of behavior, rules of the road at sea, and how to avoid incidents at sea from taking place and from escalating. These INC-Sea agreements are regarded as some of the most effective conflict management mechanisms that have ever been produced. Well, there is another agreement that ASEAN and other countries should look very closely at. It's called CUES, Code for Unalerted Encounters at Sea, which was drawn up by the Western Pacific Naval Symposium and is based on some of these INC-Sea agreements that Russia signed with Western countries. For my second point, let me take you first of all to the other side of the world. In May of 2008, in the little town of Ilulissat in Greenland, the Arctic 5 states, that is the United States, Canada, Russia, Denmark, and Norway, they issued the Ilulissat Declaration, in which they pledged to resolve their territorial, maritime boundary, and outer continental shelf claims under existing international legal regimes, especially UNCLOS. Basically, they said, we don't need any other legal regimes other than UNCLOS to resolve our disputes. And since 2008, the Arctic states have been cooperating on their disputes. And in 2010, for instance, Norway and Russia resolved their maritime boundary disputes. In the DOC, the parties have made the same pledge. But I think China's commitment to international legal regimes looks a bit shaky. As I noted earlier, it has ruled out international legal arbitration as a means to settle the dispute. And clearly, the 9-dashed line is incompatible with UNCLOS. I don't think any non-Chinese legal expert would disagree with me on that. Earlier this year, Philippine Foreign Minister Del Rosario said that the 9-dashed line is the crux of the problem in the South China Sea. I couldn't agree more with him. It not only stands in the way of a resolution of the dispute, but also joint development, which is China's preferred way of moving forward with this issue. And rather worryingly, instead of bringing its claims into line with international law, China seems to be moving the other way, arguing through words and actions that it has historical rights within the 9-dashed line. UNCLOS doesn't talk about historical rights very much. It is in there in one of the provisions, but it basically pertains to inland bays and certain areas of coastal waters. It does not apply to international waters. And let me emphasize one other point. When you sign and ratify UNCLOS, your so-called any historical rights that you may claim are extinguished. That is a basic principle of international law. In June of this year, Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi gave a speech at Tsinghua University, in which rather worryingly he said that the South China Sea dispute could only be resolved in accordance with historical facts and international law. Now that's a very interesting ordering of priorities, I think. So if any progress is to be made in the South China Sea, China either needs to bring its claims into line with international law. For instance, if it's just claiming sovereignty over the atolls within the 9-dashed line, I think that's fine. That's the same as all the other claimants. Or better yet, it could actually discard, get rid of, throw away the 9-dashed line. Though, of course, I think that is highly unlikely. I think the Philippines should be congratulated for legally challenging the 9-dashed line under UNCLOS when it submitted its claims to the UN in January of this year. Hopefully, Perhaps the arbitral tribunal will rule that the 9-dash line is indeed incompatible with UNCLOS. Although I fear that even if they do make this ruling, China will simply ignore it. And the problem will remain. Brings me to my third point. All countries in the Asia-Pacific region and beyond have a collective and common interest in ensuring peace and stability in the South China Sea and the free flow of maritime trade, freedom of navigation in the air and under the water, and protecting the rights and responsibilities of coastal states under UNCLOS. States that share these values should coordinate their positions and continually emphasize their importance and raise their concerns at regional and international forums. A good start was made in 2010 when 12 countries raised the South China Sea at the ASEAN Regional Forum. And a number of states have reiterated their concerns since then, both at the ARF and the East Asia Summit. This practice, I think, needs to be continued, strengthened, and expanded to other forums as well. The South China Sea is a very significant fishing ground. We often talk about oil and gas, but actually, as far as maritime resources go, fishing is hugely important as well. Roughly 10% of the world's fish is caught in the South China Sea. And therefore, this area is vitally important for the food security of literally hundreds of millions of people in Southeast Asia. Yet overfishing and illegal, unregulated and underreported fishing present a critical threat to biodiversity in the South China Sea and hence food security in Southeast Asia as a whole. These problems are exacerbated by contested maritime jurisdiction caused by overlapping exclusive economic zones. And here again, the 9-dash line is really the crux of the problem because it cuts into the EEZs of the Philippines, Brunei, Malaysia, Indonesia, and Vietnam. Over the past few decades, we've seen numerous incidents in which coastal authorities have detained or even opened fire on trawlers deemed to be fishing illegally in their waters, some of which have led to fatalities, as we saw in May of this year when a Taiwanese fisherman was tragically killed in the South China Sea. Ongoing tensions have prevented the claimants from engaging in meaningful talks on jointly managing fisheries. And as a result, fishing stocks are rapidly being depleted in the South China Sea. As a matter of priority, then, the relevant parties should engage in talks, either bilaterally or multilaterally, to regulate fishing activities in areas of overlapping jurisdiction, just as Japan and Taiwan did earlier this year. And hopefully Taiwan and the Philippines will do so soon, and how to jointly manage fish stocks. Here again, I go back to the Arctic. At the height of the Cold War in 1976, Russia and Norway established a joint fisheries management agency, which set quotas for both countries for fishing catch. This in spite of, or because of, a disputed maritime border. The one I mentioned earlier, which was resolved in 2010. But that joint fisheries management agency still exists. And indeed now the Arctic 5 have begun discussions on jointly managing fish stocks in Arctic waters in view of the fact that because of global warming and the melting ice, the waters are getting warmer and there are likely to be more and more fish in that area. So they are already anticipating this problem. ASEAN and China, on the other hand, there are almost no talks on jointly managing fisheries in the South China Sea. So I think an agreement on joint fishing zones and mechanisms to jointly manage fishing stocks would not only remove a persistent source of friction among the claimants, but also enhance food security in Southeast Asia. But here again, we run into the problem of the 9-dash line. Determining the scale of hydrocarbon oil and gas resources in the South China Sea is very difficult due to ongoing tensions. And energy companies are naturally unwilling to expend vast amounts of money on surveys in areas of high tensions. But to me, it almost doesn't matter how much oil and gas is in the South China Sea. It is the perception that the South China Sea is rich in oil and gas that is one of the central drivers of this dispute. But as long as the dispute continues, those resources will remain locked under the seabed. And this in a time of rising demand for energy resources and declining production of oil and gas in both China and Southeast Asia. Now, the idea of joint development has been around for several decades and in fact has become something of a mantra in China. But Beijing has never really explained to us, certainly not to me, how to operationalize joint development. What does it mean? How do you do it? They just say it, joint development is the way forward, but there's no follow-through on what it actually means. And in 2011, when the Philippines suggested the Zone of Peace, Freedom, Friendship and Cooperation, which I think was essentially a way of operationalizing Deng Xiaoping's maxim to solve the sovereignty issue and engage in joint exploration and exploitation of maritime resources, China simply rejected it out of hand. To me, joint development, as I mentioned earlier, in disputed areas is a bit unrealistic, I think. It's been done in other parts of the world, of course, yes, but almost always covering relatively small areas of maritime space, and generally between two countries. In the South China Sea, the area under dispute is very large, and we have 6 parties involved. Oh, and by the way, 5 of those parties don't recognize the other one as a sovereign state, which complicates things even further. I think the South China Sea claimant should look to Europe. In the 1960s, the United Kingdom, Norway, and the Netherlands delimited their maritime boundaries so that there could be no arguments over rights to develop North Sea oil and gas. In 2010, as I also mentioned earlier, Russia and Norway delimited their disputed maritime boundary so that energy projects could move forward. In Southeast Asia, Malaysia and Brunei in 2009 settled their EEZ claims and joint development is proceeding. So there are models on which to base joint development. But to my mind, it would be better if the South China Sea claimants agreed to settle their maritime boundaries first, before developing the energy resources. But once again, we run into the problem of the 9-dashed line, which covers 80% of the South China Sea and eats into the EEZs of almost all the coastal states. So in conclusion then, I think the next 10 years will likely be a crucial phase in the long-running saga of the South China Sea dispute. The window of opportunity to make progress is limited. I cannot believe that the status quo can continue indefinitely. I think the status quo, as it presently is, must have a limited shelf life. But what the post-status quo situation looks like, well, I'm an academic and, that puts us outside our zone of comfort talking about the future. But if the claimants design and implement an effective set of conflict prevention and crisis management mechanisms, provide legal clarity to their claims, not just China, but the other claimants as well, and finally muster the political will to pursue a negotiated settlement that resolves their territorial and maritime boundary claims, then I think the future is quite bright. But if the status quo continues and tensions are allowed to fester, I think that this dispute will almost certainly become increasingly inflated with the geopolitical rivalry between the United States and China, rendering this problem utterly intractable for at least a few more generations. I'm sorry to end on such a downbeat note, but hopefully I can be a little bit more positive in our discussions later. But anyway, thank you for your attention.